My name is Ren Calloway, and I am 26 years old. And on a Tuesday morning in October, my parents handed me a 30-day eviction notice on the porch of the farmhouse where I had grown up, where my grandfather had taught me to read the soil, and where I had come back 2 years ago to help when he started declining, and somebody needed to be present. And I had always been the somebody. They handed it to me like I was a tenant they were removing. My father held the envelope, and my mother stood behind him with the specific expression she uses when she has decided something and needs my father to be the one who communicates it. The notice was typed. It had a date. It said I had 30 days to vacate the property. I took the envelope. Pause. I said thank you. I went inside. I want to explain what the farm was before I explain what happened next, because the farm is not just a farm, and the explanation matters for the story to make sense. My grandfather, Harold Calloway, had built the farm from a 40-acre parcel his own father had left him in 1971. By the time I was born, it was 212 acres of mixed crop and pasture in central Virginia, with a farmhouse that Harold had added to 3 times across the decades, and a barn he had built himself in 1984 with help from 2 neighbors who were both gone now. Harold had worked that land for 50 years. He knew every corner of it. He knew where the soil ran deep and where it went shallow, and which fields drained well and which ones held water in heavy rain, and where the deer came through at dusk in November, and where the best light landed in the mornings when the fog was still on the low ground. He taught me all of it. Not my parents, not my father who had grown up on the farm and left it at 18 for a job in Richmond that had become a career that had taken him away for 30 years and brought him back when Harold started needing help managing things. Not my mother, who had married my father and come to the farm as a practical matter rather than a calling. Harold taught me because I was the one who showed up every summer from age 8 onward and asked questions and listened to the answers and actually wanted to know. When I came back at 24, after finishing my business degree in Charlottesville, I came back because Harold's health had been declining for 18 months, and the farm needed consistent management that my parents were providing inconsistently around their other commitments. I had a remote analytics job I could do from anywhere, and the farm needed someone present, and I was the obvious person, and I came without being asked because waiting to be asked was not my way. I managed the farm operations for 2 years, alongside my remote work. I was in the fields by 7 and at my laptop by 9, and back in the fields in the afternoon. And I did not consider this unusual, because it was simply what the situation required and what I was built for. Harold died in August. He had been declining for 2 years, and his death was not a surprise, but it was still the end of something enormous, and I needed several weeks to understand the shape of what it was the end of. What I did not know, sitting with that loss in August, was that Harold had spent some of those 2 years doing something I was not aware of. The eviction notice arrived in October, 6 weeks after Harold died. 6 weeks after the funeral and the family gathering and the initial conversations about the estate that my parents had dominated with the specific, comfortable authority of people who have already decided what something means and are simply narrating that meaning to the room. My parents' narrative was straightforward. The farm passed to Harold's children, meaning my father and his sister Diane, who lived in North Carolina and had not been to the farm in 4 years. My father and Diane would make decisions about what to do with it going forward. My father's preference, which my mother strongly supported, was to sell the farm to a developer who had been expressing interest in the land for the past 18 months, and whose offer was significant enough to produce a retirement that my parents found compelling. I had not been consulted about any of this. I had been on the farm for 2 years. I had managed its operations. I had been the person present for Harold's final months. None of that, in my parents' understanding of the situation, gave me standing in decisions about what happened to the farm. I was a grandchild. Grandchildren were not in the will. The will left everything to Harold's children. The farm would be sold. I would need to find somewhere else to live. The eviction notice was their way of initiating that process. 30 days, clean and formal, and designed to make the situation clear without requiring a difficult conversation. What they had not done at any point in the 6 weeks between Harold's death and that Tuesday morning was pull the deed. I had not pulled the deed either. Not because I had a reason to. I had come back to help Harold. I had managed the farm because it needed managing. I had not been thinking about what would happen to the farm after he was gone. Because while he was alive, and then while I was grieving, I had not been thinking in those terms. The deed had not been relevant to anything I was doing. It had not occurred to me to look at it. It occurred to me on Tuesday afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with the eviction notice in front of me, specifically because I was looking for something, anything, that would tell me what my actual position was in this situation. I was not looking for a way to fight. I was looking to understand what was true. Those are different things, and I want to be clear about the distinction because it matters for understanding what I did next. I opened Harold's filing cabinet. He had kept it in his office, a small room off the kitchen that smelled like pipe tobacco and paper and the specific ordered quiet of a man who had kept records carefully his entire life. The cabinet had labeled folders for every aspect of the farm's administration: insurance, crop records, equipment maintenance, tax filings going back 30 years, and at the back of the second drawer, in a folder labeled simply Deed, a document that was 23 pages long and that had been updated, according to the date on the most recent amendment page, 14 months ago. 14 months ago, when I had been on the farm for 8 months, when Harold had been declining but was still lucid, when I had been in the fields every day and at the kitchen table with him every evening, talking about the farm and what it had been and what it could be. I sat at Harold's kitchen table and I read the deed.
I want to tell you what the deed said without overstating it because the truth of it does not need embellishment, and embellishment would actually make it less powerful than the plain version. Harold had owned the farm outright. No mortgage. Clear title in his name alone for the past 22 years after the final payment on the original land loan. In his will, he had left the farm to his children equally, meaning my father and my Aunt Diane. That was what my parents had read and what they had based their understanding of the situation on. What they had not read, because they had not pulled the deed itself, was the amendment Harold had filed 14 months ago with the county recorder's office. A deed amendment that added a name to the title as a co-owner with the right of survivorship on a specific portion of the property. The name was mine. Harold had conveyed to me a 31% co-ownership interest in the farm property, including the farmhouse and the 40 acres immediately surrounding it, meaning the original parcel that his father had left him in 1971. The remaining 171 acres had been left to his children as stated in the will. But the original parcel, the farmhouse, the barn he had built in 1984, and the fields that surrounded them, those had my name on the title, alongside Harold's. The right of survivorship meant that upon Harold's death, my ownership interest transferred fully and automatically to me. No probate required. No will needed. It had already happened by operation of law the moment Harold died. I sat with that for about 20 minutes. Not because I did not understand it, because I wanted to make sure I understood it completely and accurately before I did anything with the understanding. I read the amendment 3 times. I looked up the right of survivorship in Virginia property law on my phone. I confirmed that what I was reading meant what I thought it meant. Then I called an attorney. Her name was Patricia Osei, and she had handled Harold's estate planning for 12 years, and she answered on the second ring when I called and said, "Ren, I have been expecting you to call." That sentence told me everything I needed to know about whether Harold had told anyone. He had told Patricia. He had not told me because he had wanted me to find it when the time was right. He had not told my parents because he had understood exactly what the time being right was going to require. Patricia confirmed everything the deed said. She said, "Your grandfather was very specific about what he wanted and very deliberate about how he structured it." She said, The 31% interest, including the farmhouse and original parcel, is yours outright. She said, your parents cannot evict you from property you own. I said, what do I do next? She said, you write them a letter. I said, what kind of letter? She said, a very simple one. The letter was 4 sentences. Patricia drafted it, and I reviewed it, and it said exactly what needed to be said without any additional language that would have cluttered the precision of it. It said that I had reviewed the title to the farm property and had discovered the deed amendment filed 14 months ago. It said that I held a 31% co ownership interest in the original parcel, including the farmhouse and surrounding 40 acres. It said that as a co owner, I had the legal right to occupy the property and that the eviction notice had no legal standing in relation to my portion of the property. It said that I was happy to discuss the administration of the estate going forward and that I looked forward to that conversation. My parents received the letter on a Thursday. My father called me the same afternoon. His voice had the quality of a man who has received information that has reorganized several things simultaneously and who is still in the process of that reorganization. He said, Ren, what is this? I said, it is a letter about the deed. He said, what deed? I said, the deed to the farm, the one that has my name on it. He said, what do you mean your name is on it? I said, Grandpa added me as a co-owner 14 months ago. Dad, I said it as gently as I could because he was my father, and because gently was the right register for this particular conversation, even if he had not been gentle with the eviction notice. I said, I did not know either. I found out when I read it Tuesday afternoon. My father was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Harold never mentioned it. I said, I know. He said, why would he do that without telling us? I said, I think you should ask Patricia. She handled it. He said, why Patricia? I said, because she can explain the legal reasoning better than I can, and because having that conversation with her rather than with me is probably better for everyone right now. My mother called an hour after my father. Her call was more difficult because my mother processes difficult information with emotion first and analysis second, and the emotion was significant. She said, this is not what Harold intended. I said, with respect, Mom, the deed is the clearest possible expression of what Harold intended. He filed it with the county 14 months ago. He had it notarized and recorded. He told Patricia. Whatever he may have said in conversation is one thing. What he put on the legal record is what he actually did. She said, you cannot expect us to just accept this. I said, I am not asking you to accept anything today. I said, I am asking for a conversation, a real one, about what the farm is and what it should be and what Grandpa actually wanted for it. She said, we know what he wanted. I said, I know you believe that. I said, the deed suggests there was more to what he wanted than any of us fully knew. That stopped the conversation in the way that accurate statements sometimes stop conversations when they arrive at the right moment. Not dramatically, decisively. My mother said she would talk to my father. I said that was fine. I said I would be here. I had nowhere to go. The farmhouse was on my land. The conversation happened the following Saturday. My parents drove out from Richmond and we sat at Harold's kitchen table, the same table where I had read the deed on Tuesday afternoon, and we talked for 3 hours about the farm and what it meant and what Harold had wanted and what I wanted and what they wanted and what was actually possible given what the deed said. It was the most honest conversation our family had ever had. That is not an exaggeration. It is simply true. My parents and I had never had a conversation that required us all to be fully present with what was actually real rather than what we each preferred to be real. And the deed made the avoidance of what was real impossible in a way that nothing else in our family history had previously managed. My father said he had not known Harold felt this way about the farm's future. I said, Dad, I think he did not know how to say it directly. I think he felt that leaving the farm entirely to you and Aunt Diane meant leaving it in the hands of people who were going to sell it, and he did not want it sold. And the only person he knew who actually wanted to keep it and knew how to run it was me. My father looked at the table. He said, I did not know you felt that way about the farm. I said, you did not ask. He said, no, he did not argue the point. He just said no, which was the most honest thing he could have said. My Aunt Diane called from North Carolina that evening. She had been briefed by my father, and she was calmer about it than I had expected, which I later understood was because Diane had her own complicated feelings about what selling the farm would have meant and had been somewhat relieved by the complication, even if she would not have said so directly. She said, "Ren, I think Harold knew what he was doing." I said, "I do too." She said, "Let us figure out what makes sense." I said, "Yes, let us do that." What made sense was a buyout agreement that took 4 months to finalize. My parents and Diane retained their ownership of the 171 acres of agricultural land, which was sold not to the developer, but to a neighboring farm operation at a price that was fair and that provided the retirement support my parents had been looking for. The original 40-acre parcel, the farmhouse, the barn, and the fields Harold had worked first, those remained mine. I bought out a small remaining interest from Diane, using proceeds from a loan secured by the property itself. Patricia handled the paperwork. By the following spring, I held clear majority title to the farm Harold had started with in 1971, and I was operating it as a working property with 3 seasonal employees and a revenue model that combined crop production with agritourism, a direction Harold and I had talked about at the kitchen table more than once in those evening conversations I had not fully understood were also planning sessions. My parents came out for Thanksgiving, my mother helped in the kitchen. My father walked the fields in the afternoon the way Harold used to walk them, slowly and with the particular attention of a man who grew up on land and whose relationship with it is complicated and real. He came back to the house and said, "Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing." I said, "He always did." My father nodded. He sat down at the kitchen table that had been Harold's and was now mine, and we had dinner. And the conversation was the kind that happens between people who have been through something real together and have come out the other side, still able to sit at the same table. Harold's filing cabinet is still in the office off the kitchen. I have added my own folders to it. The label on the front now has 2 sets of handwriting, his and mine, which is exactly the right way for something to look when it has been passed from one careful person to another. If your grandfather or your grandmother put something in a document that you have not looked at yet, look at it. Not out of suspicion, out of the specific love of understanding what someone meant when they were planning for you before you knew you needed to be planned for. Harold saw what was coming. He prepared for it in the only way that was permanent and clear and impossible to argue with. He put my name on the deed. That is my story. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.